Fellas, since we've just had two champ versus champ fights at UFC 322, I thought we'd rank a bunch of the main champ versus champ fights in the UFC, and it's going to be ranked purely on how good the fight was, not on the hype, not anything like that, just how good the fight was between the two champions on a tier list, S tier to D tier, and we'll go in there with the most recent one. Della versus Makhachev. Now, this is a massive fight, obviously, coming into it. You had Makhachev, who had dominated 155. No one really seemed to be beating this guy at lightweight. Moving up a weight class, take on JDM, who just had a great performance over Belal Muhammad, won the belt, undefeated in the UFC. It was a huge fight, a legacy-defining fight for Makhachev as well. But would I recommend people to go and watch this fight? Probably not. And I don't really blame either men for this. You know, Makhachev's style is taking people down and getting the submission. You pair that with JDM, who's got amazing submission defense. It's kind of going to be a bit of a repeat over and over again. Makhachev constantly taking down JDM, looking for the submission, not getting it. It wasn't overly active with ground and pound either. I guess the biggest highlight of the fight was Makhachev chopping at the leg of JDM and injuring him, kind of getting the damage done to his leg. But the fight itself wasn't super action-packed. JDM didn't really do too much on the feet. A lot of his strikes were head kicks as well, which were questionable against the grappler. And when they did hit the ground, again, it was a lot of Makhachev threatening submissions, not getting the submissions, and it kind of being a repeat from round 1 to round 5. So it was a bit of a kind of Chimaev DDP revamp as well. I mean, there's a little bit more striking taking place in this matchup, and I think Makhachev was a little bit more active than Chimaev, but it kind of was a revamp of that. I know the fan reception on this fight hasn't been too good either, so this might seem harsh. I'm going to put it in D tier. I mean, we're comparing this to every champ versus champ fight we've ever had. And again, I'm not taking away from Makhachev. Again, legacy-defining performances. Now catapulted himself into one of the top 3 greatest of all time. And Della Maddalena did really good with the submission defense. But would I recommend somebody to go and rewatch this fight again for 25 minutes? No. You can summarize this fight pretty easily. Makhachev takes him down every round, controls him with the grappling, threatens a submission, doesn't get it, attacks the leg, fight's over. That is pretty much the perfect summary of this fight. So big fight, big implications, massive implications, but the fight itself, it is a D tier fight. Wasn't entertaining really at all. No really big moments either. So Della Maddalena versus Makhachev, I'm going to stick that in D tier. And talking of 322 super fights, Shevchenko versus Zhang, which kind of followed the same. It was kind of very similar to Della Maddalena versus Makhachev. Obviously, Shevchenko got a belt back from Grasso, defended against Fiora, and obviously, I think Zhang Weili deserved to move up a weight class because she's so far ahead of the strawweight division. The fight took place, and again, it was kind of similar in the sense that it was just Shevchenko being way bigger than Zhang Weili and dominating Zhang Weili, for pure size. I will say Shevchenko did good in the feet, though. There's a lot of times when Shevchenko would sting Zhang Weili with a couple of body kicks. They had a lot of striking exchanges where Shevchenko had quite a few moments, which is why I've ramped it up a little bit. So it wasn't necessarily a complete snooze fest, but I just feel like Shevchenko wasn't really active on the ground. It was a lot of a control-heavy style, which seems to be the new style of Shevchenko, and a couple of striking moments too. So I'll put this one in C tier. I thought it was a slightly better fight than the Makhachev versus Maddalena from an entertainment standpoint. Shevchenko looked good on the feet, blasting the body kicks, landed a couple of head kicks, that spinning back fist in the first round, and obviously dominated Zhang Weili on the ground. She dominated it everywhere the fight went, but again, there wasn't really any crazy moments. I mean, Zhang Weili did nothing. There was not a single moment in the entire fight from Zhang Weili. It was mainly just from Shevchenko, and even then, there wasn't any, crazy moments, any crazy highlight reels to come from this fight. So, Shevchenko versus Zhang Weili in terms of champ versus champ fights, I'm going to stick that one in C tier. And then we've got Topuria versus Oliveira at 317. Now, obviously, Topuria wasn't actually the featherweight champion at the time. He'd vacated the belt, but he never really lost the belt. And I'm counting this as a champ versus champ fight because this was the first time they started taking the belt away from the champion. And obviously Topuria, he knocked out Holloway, knocked out Volkanovski. He wanted to move up a weight class. And Oliveira was coming off that good win of a Michael Chandler. Sarukian was inactive. Makhachev were already planning on moving a weight class, so this was what happened. 2 minutes it took in the first round. There wasn't no 25-minute slugfest. It was 2 minutes into the fight. Topuria lands on Oliveira, trips him with a massive right hand, and knocks out Charles Oliveira, becoming a champion in a second weight class. And you've got to give him that alone. Becoming a double champion, he wasn't really a double champion. He's a 2-divisional champion, but winning that lightweight belt in the fashion that he did, knocking out Oliveira, finishing him quicker than Makhachev. I know Oliveira's not exactly this guy who's super tough to knock out, but he's kind of known for having a bad chin, and Topuria was a favourite. But I'm going to stick it in S tier. For a champ versus champ fight, you want a moment like that. 2 minutes into the first round, Topuria clips Oliveira, knocks him out in the first big exchange of the fight. So I'll put that one in S tier. Legacy-defining performance from Topuria, moving up a weight class, winning the lightweight belt. Again, only showing that he's even more unstoppable, getting that pound-for-pound number 1 status. So Topuria, Oliveira. As an Oliveira fan, it was sad to see, but for the fight itself, the way it ended, the highlight reel it produced, one of the best knockouts of 2025. I'm going to have to give it an S tier. And then we've got Makhachev versus Volkanovski 2 at UFC 294, the rematch they had in Abu Dhabi. Now, the problem with this is it was on 12 days' notice, and I'm not taking anything away from Makhachev's performance, but it wasn't prime physical peak Volkanovski. He was coming off the couch drinking, apparently, and like I said, he stepped up on 12 days' notice for what was supposed to be Oliveira versus Makhachev. And the fight itself, I mean, you've got to give it to Makhachev. You know, a couple of minutes into the first round, he lands a clubbing head kick on Alexander Volkanovski and knocks out Volkanovski. And this was massive for Makhachev. Not only did he beat Volkanovski again, he'd finished one of the best strikers in the UFC, first guy to knock out Volkanovski, and he also showcased the striking of Makhachev, showing that he's not just one-dimensional. So this was massive for Makhachev's career, and obviously it produced a highlight reel. I'm going to have to put it in B tier, though. The highlight reel itself, again, it might be in A or S tier, because, again, Makhachev knocking out Volkanovski as a visual is a massive thing to happen, but the fact that it was on 12 days' notice, it wasn't a full training camp, I think that does definitely knock a few points down. And again, seeing Volkanovski get knocked out in that fashion, nobody wants to see that. But Makhachev Volk 2, I'll stick that one in B tier. Then we've got Makhachev versus Volk 1 at UFC 284. This was on in Perth, Australia. Now, at this time, Makhachev had only just won the belt off Oliveira. He hadn't defended the belt a single time, and he already had to take on Volkanovski moving up a weight class. And this was prime Volkanovski. He was smoking everybody at featherweight. He came off that 50-45 performance over Max Holloway. This was a huge fight. This is one of the best champ versus champ fights ever. Fight of the year 2023. One of the best fights in modern history. Pound for pound, number 1 versus number 2. This was as good as a fight you could get. Volkanovski had moments on the feet. Makhachev had moments off the ground. They both came to scrap. It was a 25-minute scrap. One of the best title fights we've had in modern history. So for Volkanovski versus Makhachev, obviously the decision might have caused a bit of controversy. It was a very close fight, but I think that just showed to how good of a performance they both put on. And I personally did think Makhachev won the fight. Makhachev versus Volk 1. I'm going to have to put that one in S tier. Again, I don't really want to take into account hype too much on this. I just want to base it off the fight alone. But I think in this fight, you have got to kind of counter in the hype too. Like I said, it was champion versus champion. Makhachev who looked unstoppable versus Volk who looked unstoppable. Volk finally getting a chance at 155 against the guy who seemed like he was dominating 155 or was going to dominate 155. Pound for pound number 1 versus number 2. And on top of that, to put the cherry on top, the fight itself was amazing. The Perth crowd was amazing. Volkanovski Makhachev, instant S tier for a champ versus champ fight. And then we've got Jan Blachowicz versus Israel Adesanya, 259. Adesanya moving up a weight class. Now, obviously, this was when Adesanya was dominating the middleweight division. He had that massive performance over Paulo Costa, where he practically bullied Costa. And with Justin Jan Blachowicz knock out Dominic Reyes. This had a lot of hype going into it, but the fight itself, I think he just wasn't that good of a fight. I mean, the striking exchanges, nothing crazy happened. It was a lot of Adesanya feinting. Jan Blachowicz would land, but the commentary would glaze Adesanya. The commentary in this fight, I remember being unbearable. They were glazing Adesanya to the next level. There was a lot of control wrestling from Jan Blachowicz, which was the smart game plan to win. It just wasn't that good for a champ versus champ fight. I think this was evident that Adesanya wasn't built for 205. It was he looked like a boy in a man's world. The fight itself, I mean, it wasn't an awful fight, but again, it was a lot of Adesanya feinting. Jan Blachowicz tagging Adesanya every now and then, landing a couple of leg kicks, then taking him down to control him with the wrestling. You pair that with the fact that it was in the apex. You pair that with the fact that the commentary was unbearable. I'm going to have to put this one all the way down in C tier. It wasn't an awful fight. Again, it had a bit of hype going into it, and Adesanya was in his prime. It was a massive star. But the fight itself, it wasn't that amazing of a fight. Nothing crazy really happened. It didn't seem like two champions going at it. And again, the circumstances in which it took place definitely deduct points. So, Jan Blachowicz versus Adesanya, I'm going to put that one in C tier. Then we've got Cejudo versus Moraes, when Cejudo was obviously the flyweight champion, moved up and took on Moraes for the vacant bantamweight belt. Technically not champ versus champ, but, it's a champ having a shot at a different weight class while still being a champ. I'm going to stick that one in 80. This was where Cejudo was supposed to be the next big thing. He was taking on Moraes, who had one of the biggest downfalls in the history of the sport. This guy was knocking everybody out, looked unstoppable, and then he had this huge downfall. But at this time, Moraes was looking crisp, man. He was coming off a really good finisher as well, I remember. I think I remember. And then obviously Cejudo, being the flyweight champion, moved up, and then he ends up finishing Moraes, gets the TKO finish over Moraes. Massive win for Cejudo's career. And even after the Moraes fight, he would go on to get a couple more finishes at bantamweight. So, yeah, I'm going to put that one in 80. A good finish. Again, there wasn't really a crowd, so that kind of ruined it again. But Cejudo Moraes, good finish for Cejudo. I'm going to put that one in 80. Then we had Cormier versus DC. Now, this was a massive fight. I mean, you had Cormier, who was dominating the light heavyweight division, just dominated Volkanovski. You had Stipe, who seemed like he was going to go on a generational run in the heavyweight division, just beating Ngannou. Had a couple of finishes before that. They took place, and even Cormier was quite a big underdog going into this fight. Not a substantial underdog, but he wasn't like a massive upset. But a lot of people expected Stipe to win, so when Cormier finishes him, I think it was like he was a couple of minutes into the first round, DC lands a clubbing shot on him, knocks out Stipe. Nobody fully expected this to happen as well. I think most people expected if DC was to win, it would be by some via ground and pound finish or like a decision. But for DC to knock him out in the first round, knock out the KO artist in Stipe Miocic, moved up a weight class to become a champion in the second weight class. No one saw this coming. So for DC versus Stipe, again, it's going to go in S tier. It was in front of a crowd. It was literally the two best in their both divisions. They both dominated their divisions. It wasn't like a Topuria moving up situation where Topuria had only just won the belt and then he was moving up a weight class. They both dominated their divisions. And again, for DC being the underdog to knock out the KO puncher up a weight class and Stipe Miocic, get the highlight reel and set up the trilogy. Massive moment for DC. He became a double champion. Huge moment for the heavyweight division overall. Stipe versus DC, that's going straight into S tier. And then we've got McGregor versus Alvarez. Probably one of the most iconic, or probably the most iconic champ versus champ fight. Now, Alvarez had only just won the belt over Rafael dos Anjos. He wasn't like a dominant champion. He was on a 3-fight winning streak in the UFC, beat dos Anjos to become the champion. And obviously, McGregor was the featherweight champion. He had those fights with Nate Diaz at welterweight, but he was still the featherweight champion. And this was one of the most iconic performances ever. Some people say this was one of the best performances in MMA history. McGregor was in the flow state. He was so far ahead of Eddie Alvarez, just pinging him across the place, tagging Eddie Alvarez, taunting him, bullying him on the feet until eventually he obviously went for that combination, went for the kill that everybody's seen already, one of the best highlight reels of his career, knocking out Eddie Alvarez, moving up a weight class from featherweight and becomes double champion. And again, probably the most iconic champ versus champ because he was the first simultaneous double champion in the UFC. The way that he did it as well, the hype that he had back in the day as well, McGregor was, and it still is, the biggest star in history. And again, this is one of the reasons why he did it. The first real champ versus champ. I feel like McGregor kind of started this whole era of champions facing champions because before McGregor, the last kind of champ versus champ fight was back in like 2008. So I think McGregor was the guy who kind of brought this back, and it was because of this iconic moment with Alvarez. So I'm stick that one in S tier. I mean, it kind of deserves a tier of his own. I know he wasn't really facing this super dominant champion. I'm not trying to act like Eddie Alvarez is like some insane champion, but for the way that McGregor did it as well, the fact that he was so far ahead of him, he was in the flow state, he bullied Alvarez and got the finish, and again, held the two belts at the same time. Yeah, one of the best moments in the history of the sport. I'm going to have to put that one in S tier. And then we've got GSP versus BJ Penn. Two of some of the greatest of all time, obviously. BJ Penn being the lightweight champion, moving up to face GSP for the welterweight champion. At this time, GSP had only just really started his run again. He'd beat Matt Serra. Again, he'd gone out there beating John Fitch as well for his defense in the welterweight division, and BJ Penn had just beat Sean Sherk at 155. This was a pretty decent fight. There was a bit of controversy as well. BJ Penn did very well on the feet. He was kind of tagging GSP on the feet. GSP did well on the ground. Very, very close fight, and already they were both like bloodied and bruised after the first couple of rounds until eventually GSP gets the job done. There was a bit of controversy. I remember a lot of people thought that BJ Penn should have won the fight. It was a very, very close fight, but it was a pretty good chess match overall. Wasn't like a fight of the year contender. Wasn't like one of the scraps that I'd recommend everybody should go and watch back, but it wasn't a bad fight, so to speak. It was a very mixed martial arts fight. Two goals, bit of wrestling, bit of striking, both had their moments. GSP gets the job done. I'm going to put that one in B tier. Again, solid fight. Nothing crazy memorable took place. GSP gets the job done, but it was a solid fight between two champions, and again, looking back in retrospect, two of some of the greatest of all time. Then we've got Rampage Jackson versus Dan Henderson. This was when Rampage Jackson knocked out Chuck Liddell when he first came to the UFC, won the light heavyweight belt, and Dan Henderson was the middleweight champion after beating Wanderlei Silva. Yeah, this was a good fight as well. A very kind of balanced fight. Dan Henderson did really well on the feet, tagged Rampage Jackson quite a bit on the feet. Rampage Jackson did well back, fired back, and obviously took down and did a lot of wrestling over Dan Henderson. It was kind of like a grapple-heavy performance. There was a lot of grappling from Rampage Jackson, so again, it was like a fight of the year contender, but it was a really solid fight. Again, for a champion versus champion fight, a solid back-and-forth fight between the two of them. I'm going to put this one in B tier. They both had their moments. I remember that Octagon interview as well this provided with Rampage Jackson, one of his more memorable Octagon interviews. But yeah, just another really good fight. A lot of wrestling from Rampage Jackson, back and forth on the feet. It was a solid title fight. So yeah, I'll put that one in B tier. Nothing crazy happened, no crazy finish. Rampage wins the decision, but it wasn't a bad fight, so to speak. And then we've got Amanda Nunes versus Chris Cyborg, where Amanda Nunes moved up to 145 to take on Chris Cyborg. This was a massive fight, one of the biggest fights in the women's MMA history. You had Amanda Nunes, who was already a star after the way she manhandled Ronda Rousey and then went on to beat Shevchenko and finish Raquel Pennington. And you also had Chris Cyborg, who I think had only one professional loss at the time. She was the flyweight champion, looked like she was coming over to dominate the UFC. And Amanda Nunes was a massive underdog. Even after all that she's accomplished, Chris Cyborg was that hyped. She was a massive favourite coming into this fight, and obviously we see Amanda Nunes go out there and get a statement-making knockout over Chris Cyborg. Knocks out Chris Cyborg, and like I said, Amanda Nunes was already quite a big star at the time, so to see her finish Cyborg as an underdog, you can imagine how much this catapulted the hype of Amanda Nunes. Massive moment for Nunes. I feel like this was where she kind of solidified herself as the greatest women MMA fighter of all time. I feel like after she beat Cyborg, there's never really been a conversation over who else could be the GOAT over Amanda Nunes. There's obviously talks nowadays of Shevchenko, but it's pretty much since this fight took place, it's always been Amanda Nunes, so I must stick that one in S tier. One of the greatest moments in the women's MMA history. Amanda Nunes moving up against Cyborg, who again had only one loss in her entire career, and I'm pretty sure it was her debut. She was dominating everybody in other organizations. Came over to the UFC to win the featherweight belt, and Nunes gets her out of there. Massive moment for Nunes. Nobody really saw that coming. If anybody was going to get a knockout, most people thought it would come from Cyborg. Highlight reel happens. Nunes, Cyborg. I'm going to give that one S tier. But that'll be a quick tier list on how I'd rank every champ versus champ fight based on the fight itself. Again, there's been a lot of champ versus champ fights in the UFC. I feel like some of them definitely performed. A lot of highlight reels, very memorable. I feel like some of them, especially some of the more recent ones, you know, like Shevchenko, Weili, and Della Maddalena versus Makhachev, even though they were big moments for their both careers and it was big legacy-defining performances, the fights themselves, not exactly the most memorable. So let me know your thoughts on this list. Would you switch anything around? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.